North Sudan is an easily overlooked country in northeast Africa that has had a recent history of violence and repression. While there are various topics that could be covered on this country, this video will focus on the current privacy of the Sudanese people and the events leading up to it. In order to understand the situation that North Sudan faces, we need to look at the history of the country. Originally, Sudan was one country, combining North Sudan and its southern neighbor, which is obviously South Sudan. In 1955, a civil war broke out between the two countries after unviewed representation complaints from the southern portion of Sudan. This war came to be known as the First Sudanese Civil War and resulted in the deaths of around 500,000 people. The Civil War ended in 1972 with a mutual agreement between the rebel leadership and the Sudanese government. This agreement may have formed a temporary peace, but did not fully dispel the tensions between North and South Sudan. In 1983, violence once again erupted in Sudan in the Second Sudanese Civil War. The second conflict was considerably more destructive than the first, amassing a death toll of almost 2 million. Not only was the civilian death toll incredibly high, but the population also started suffering from mass starvation caused by the war. In 1989, the North Sudanese army expressed its discontent for the handling of the conflict, claiming that the war should either not be supported or that the military is given the means to end the war, after Sadiq al-Mahdi, the Sudanese prime minister at the time, called for the arrest of military officials in an attempt to solidify his control in the government. Colonel Omar Hassan al-Bashir gained the support he needed to lead a bloodless coup d'etat and overthrew al-Mahdi. The Second Sudanese Civil War continued for 22 years and was finally ended by a peace agreement in 2005. While this war had no clear victor, in 2011 North Sudan surrendered independence to South Sudan and recognized it as an independent country. Now, after dealing with the Civil War for the past 56 years, North Sudan is free of its conflict with South Sudan, but they are still suffering from the effects of the war. In 2014, conflict was ignited again when President al-Bashir called for the arrest of Dr. Amin Mekki Mindani, former president of the Sudan Human Rights Monitor, because of his civil rights activities. This arrest created tension between the United Nations and the Sudanese government, as well as helped build up civil unrest. Fearing the buildup of anti-government groups, al-Bashir began to place restrictions that conflict with the rights outlined in the Sudanese constitution. Al-Bashir's attempts to restrict the Sudanese people is where privacy comes into play. The Sudanese government have since expanded their attempts to silence anti-government groups by conducting searches of homes and taking electronics without warrants, monitoring private communications, tracking the movements of individuals and groups without warning, and placing government informants to conduct surveillance in schools, universities, markets, workplaces, and neighborhoods. These breaches of privacy are specifically targeted at people suspected, with or without evidence, of political crimes. The government has not only invaded the privacy of the Sudanese people, though. They have also taken measures to restrict public gatherings and what Sudanese citizens could say and write. For example, NISS confiscated print runs of 10 newspapers. Authorities gave no justification, but observers believe the newspapers were targeted because of their intention to publish a press statement by the UN Special Reporter on violence against women who visited the country. There have also been suspected cyberspace interferences in Sudan. According to outside reports, a government unit was assigned to monitor social media accounts and electronic communications, especially those believed to belong to regime critics. Due to the attack on the Sudanese people's rights, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North formed. In knowing Sudan's history, you can probably assume where this is going. The Liberation Movement has led attacks on the Sudanese government in an unofficial civil war. During the Liberation Movement's attacks in Darfur, President al-Bashir was accused of ordering attacks on unarmed citizens, which has resulted in his indictment by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. While al-Bashir is currently still in office, there is hope that the interference of international courts could lead to the resurrection of privacy in Sudan.